Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
History, as the collective memory of humanity, shapes identities, perceptions, and power structures. Nowhere is this truer than in the history of Africa, a continent whose past has been subjected to persistent distortions, omissions, and outright fabrications. The West's attempts to rewrite African history are not merely academic exercises but strategic endeavors designed to serve colonial, economic, and ideological interests. These distortions began with the arrival of European explorers, were intensified by the transatlantic slave trade, were reinforced during the colonial era, and persist today through modern media, education, and scholarship. Africa's rich past, marked by the rise of great civilizations, scientific advancements, and cultural achievements, contradicts long-held Western narratives that sought to depict the continent as a land of chaos, primitivism, and perpetual darkness before European intervention. In this struggle over history, African voices have often been marginalized, their perspectives dismissed, and their accomplishments deliberately downplayed or erased. Yet, the question remains, why does the West continue to rewrite African history? The answer lies in a tangled web of historical guilt, economic control, racial superiority complexes, and geopolitical maneuvering. The manipulation of African history is not just a relic of the past, but an ongoing process affecting contemporary global relations, economic policies, and cultural perceptions. This article delves into the historical and contemporary mechanisms through which Africa's history has been rewritten and why the West remains invested in distorting the truth. It will explore the early falsifications, the role of academia and media in perpetuating these narratives, and the persistent resistance from African scholars and historians who seek to reclaim their past. The West's attempt to rewrite African history began with the justification of slavery. In the 15th century, as European nations sought to expand their economic and territorial control, Africa became central to the transatlantic slave trade. To rationalize this inhumane practice, European intellectuals and clergy advanced the notion that Africans were inherently inferior, uncivilized, and in need of European intervention. This ideological framework was reinforced by pseudoscientific racial theories of the 18th and 19th centuries. Thinkers such as Hegel dismissed Africa as a land with no history, while scholars like David Hume claimed that Africans had contributed nothing to civilization. These distortions were deliberately crafted to legitimize European exploitation and dehumanize African peoples. By stripping Africa of its history and civilization, colonial powers could present themselves as benevolent bringers of progress. The conquest and partition of Africa in the late 19th century, spearheaded by figures such as Cecil Rhodes and King Leopold, were justified under the pretense of the white man's burden, the idea that Europeans had a moral obligation to civilize the so-called backward peoples of Africa. During the colonial period, European powers controlled African education systems and historical narratives. Colonial governments established schools and universities that exclusively promoted Eurocentric perspectives while dismissing African oral traditions, indigenous knowledge, and pre-colonial histories. One of the greatest casualties of this period was the erasure of Africa's pre-colonial civilizations. The mighty empires of Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, and the Kingdom of Congo were downplayed or ignored altogether. The University of Timbuktu, one of the greatest centers of learning in medieval times, was omitted from historical discussions in favor of narratives that portrayed Africa as an intellectual void. Moreover, historical texts and accounts were deliberately altered to suit colonial agendas. The British, for example, rewrote histories in Kenya and Nigeria to paint resistance leaders as bandits rather than freedom fighters. The Germans in Namibia justified their genocidal campaigns against the Herero and Namakwa peoples by labeling them as subhuman savages. Even after African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, Western manipulation of African history did not cease. Western media, literature, and academia continue to frame Africa in a lens of dependency and underdevelopment, omitting the structural damages inflicted by colonial rule. The notion that Africa's struggles are self-inflicted rather than the consequences of centuries of exploitation continues to pervade global discourse. Hollywood, for instance, perpetuated stereotypes by presenting Africa as a land of endless war, disease, and famine while ignoring its rich cultural diversity and resilience. Western textbooks continue to emphasize European explorations of Africa rather than African innovations and contributions to global civilization. Furthermore, neocolonial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank have played a role in shaping African economic histories to favor Western economic models while ignoring indigenous economic systems that thrived for centuries before European intervention. Despite these distortions, African scholars and historians have continuously fought to reclaim their history. Intellectuals such as Cheikh, Anta, Diop, and John Henrik Clarke have challenged Eurocentric narratives, demonstrating Africa's central role in global civilization. Digital platforms, African universities, and cultural initiatives are now working to reconstruct authentic histories based on indigenous perspectives and sources. Governments and grassroots movements across Africa have launched campaigns to decolonize education, rewrite textbooks, and promote African heritage through museums, films, and literature. The resurgence of interest in African history among the diaspora has further strengthened these efforts, leading to a global pushback against Western distortions. The West's attempts to rewrite African history have been driven by a combination of economic interests, racial ideologies, and geopolitical strategies. By distorting Africa's past, Western powers justified slavery, colonialism, and continued economic exploitation. However, the tide is shifting as African voices reclaim their narratives, challenging centuries of misinformation. The struggle for historical truth is not just about the past. It is about shaping the future, ensuring that Africa's contributions, resilience, and achievements are rightfully acknowledged and celebrated.